We ask a lot whether art can truly be separated from the artist, but less often do we turn that question around and ask whether art can ever be separated from the audience, whoever happens to be standing in front of it in that moment. The short answer would be that there is no separation. We only ever see through the lens of what we've already lived. We sure can see less than that, and plenty of us do on most days. Choosing the smaller and simpler reading of something isn't neutral either. It's still a choice, even if it is a passive one, still just picking one narrative and letting the rest go quiet. This essay focuses on that internal shift, beyond the ancient myth of a woman with snakes for hair. The core question centers on what unfolds within us today when we select which version of her story we accept. A few weeks back, I recorded a voice note about this topic, sounding completely sure of myself, holding that distinct, I've arrived at an insight tone. I asked whether our subconscious mind has already decided which narrative to favor, even when presented with the evidence pointing somewhere else. It was a valid question. The irony was that I hadn't actually applied it to my own thinking yet. That's because I had already picked a side long before that recording. My initial impression of Medusa was purely as a monster, the video game obstacle standing between you and the real boss. Though eventually, I encountered the alternate narrative, someone who was once a woman, beautiful, devoted, assaulted, and subsequently punished by the very goddess she served. The moment I heard that account, my instinct was to accept it as the definite truth. That reaction didn't stem from fact checking, it stemmed from fit. A god abusing his power, followed by a goddess punishing the wrong target, felt completely consistent with how these ancient stories operate. The narrative made immediate sense, and that immediate sense felt like certainty. It wasn't proof, rather, recognition wearing proof's clothing, a distinction I failed to recognize at the time. So, before exploring how we select our myths, it seems worth admitting that this perspective comes directly from inside the problem. I engaged in the exact behavior this essay examines, right while making the first draft about how others do it. Looking into the sources reveals a detail that often gets overlooked. Medusa does not have a single origin story. She has at least four genuinely distinct accounts, rather than minor variations on a single plot. The first version represents the oldest written record we possess. Hesiod, around 700 BCE, in his account, Medusa was one of the three Gorgon sisters, born that way, and the only one of the three who can die. She and Poseidon meet in a soft meadow among spring flowers. That is the literal phrasing in the text. There is no curse or physical transformation, and no assault mentioned. It reads as an ordinary encounter resulting in a pregnancy, followed later by Perseus taking her life. That constitutes the entire narrative according to the earliest surviving text. The second version, a less attested ancient tradition, preserved only in the later fragments and mythographical references, such as those associated with Apollodorus, suggests that Medusa may have boasted that she was more beautiful than Athena and was punished for the comparison. No surviving ancient author develops this into a complete narrative. It remains a brief and secondary variant rather than a fully told myth. The third version is the narrative many people recognize today. Here, Medusa is a human maiden serving as a priestess in Athena's temple. Poseidon assaults her inside that sacred space, and Athena responds by transforming her, delivering the snakes, the terrifying gaze, and the exile. Here's the detail that changes how I read this version once I actually looked it up. It's not Greek, it's Roman. Ovid recorded this in Metamorphoses, roughly 700 years after Hesiod, and Ovid wasn't writing scripture. He was writing what he considered entertainment and good poetry. The fourth version also circulates widely across modern platforms, much detached from ancient sources. In this telling, Athena's act was not a punishment, but a form of protection. granting Medusa a power that ensured no man could ever approach her again. While it serves as a compelling modern reinterpretation, its history is fairly recent, belonging to contemporary culture, not antiquity. Four versions: born a monster, altered for vanity, cursed after assault, and transformed for protection. Yet, over time, these four threads have been compressed into two confident statements, often repeated as established history, that she was either an innocent victim punished for surviving or a monster meant to be slayed. That summary isn't entirely inaccurate. It simply isn't ancient. It isn't even Greek. It's simply the narrative that eventually took hold in the public imagination, and dominant version that won. And winning, it turns out, has nothing to do with it being true. There's a detail in Perseus' story that I skipped past for years without giving it a deeper thought. He never looked at Medusa directly. He relies on a shield polished to a mirror finish, tracking her through the reflection rather than the direct sight. Looking at her straight on would turn him into stone. So the entire myth is built around a man who defeats a woman he never actually sees face to face. I think that single plot mechanic carries the core weight of this topic, because direct observation has been missing from the start. Ovid worked 7 centuries after Hesiod, and modern digital spaces constructed a protective curse interpretation because it offered a more palatable framework than the existing options, at least for the last few years. My own immediate acceptance of one specific version followed the exact same path. Every iteration relies on someone else's shield, cataloging whatever reflection appears and calling it the truth. So, for the recent narrative, why did the Ovid's reflection dominate the others? It wasn't a matter of superior sources. He was writing in Latin, reinterpreting a Greek narrative from the outside. His version took hold because he was a remarkably effective writer who gave the narrative a shape that resonated. He presented a clear victim alongside a divine betrayal, transforming raw violence into a classic tragedy. It was more compelling constructed narrative instead of historical accuracy. Simply put, a better crafted identity. The central realization comes down to how we engage with these accounts. We don't usually reach for the earliest version or for the best documented one. We usually reach out for the one that reinforces an existing view of how the world operates. And once that choice is made, additional context rarely shifts the perspective. It just gets filed as more proof that we were right in the first time. Psychology offers the terms for this behavior as confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. The specific terminology matters less than recognizing the underlying pattern, because that pattern extends far beyond ancient poetry. It dictates how we process almost everything around us. A brief pause is necessary here, because what I'm bringing up next moves beyond mythology into uncomfortable territory, and I have no interest in using it just to make the point land harder. It represents the primary reason this topic demands attention. We have witnessed this exact mechanism play out in real time, surrounding with examples like the Epstein files, where victims are quietly reframed as complicit, recharacterized as active participants, or cast as somehow less innocent than the term implies. That reinterpretation offers a far more convenient narrative for those who benefit from its survival. Powerful figures end up with a version constructed around self preservation rather than the factual record. I am not putting this next to a myth to flatten the two into the same weight. Their weight is entirely different. However, it belongs in this conversation because art is meant to reflect genuine aspects of human reality, and this specific myth holds up a mirror to a persistent pattern. In Ovid's account, Medusa is the one assaulted. The goddess she served punishes her instead of the god responsible, and the version that survives for the next 2000 years shifts from an authority figure abused his power to a woman was transformed into a monster. Somewhere in that gap between what happened and what got remembered, the story quietly changed who the problem was. Victims reframed as the problem, the public reaching for whichever version lets them look away the fastest. That's not ancient habit wearing a myth's clothing. That is this week's headline in the ancient costume. I want to pause on Perseus for a second, because it would be easy, maybe too easy, to make him the villain of this essay. He is, after all, the one who actually kills her. That framing isn't entirely fair, nor does it capture the central issue. Perseus does not seek out Medusa out of personal malice. He is sent. A king wants him removed, devises an impossible assignment, and anticipates that he would die trying. Perseus is fulfilling an obligation instead of settling a personal grudge. I am not saying this to rehabilitate this character. It simply makes the analysis more honest when no single figure functions as an absolute villain. Poseidon, in the earliest account, isn't depicted as violent at all. Athena appears cruel, protective, envious, or barely present, depending entirely on which mirror you're holding up that day. And Perseus remains a young man executing a command, which might be the real discomfort sitting underneath all of this. A story without a villain feels unfinished to us. So, even in the very first version, the one where nothing violent technically happens to her in the beginning, Medusa still ends up dead. She remains designated as the monster, ultimately defined by the moment someone else decided that her story was over. Here's something that needs to be addressed here, because it would be dishonest not to. We can treat Hesiod's version with something close to reverence, because it's the oldest making in the original, and there's a real pull to just say, well, that one's true, and everything that followed is mere distortion. But that is its own kind of narrative selection, isn't it? Favoring the oldest version because the old feels inherently more authentic. It's still a choice out of comfort, not evidence. Age does not guarantee accuracy, it simply denotes chronological order. Hesiod wasn't some neutral recording device either. He was a person working within an oral tradition that had already undergone countless revisions. Calling out modern internet interpretations of constructing a protective curse narrative out of thin air is straightforward. Yet, trusting Hesiod simply because he came first is doing the exact same thing. It's just wearing a more respectable coat. There is no need resolution to that contradiction. The most transparent approach is to state it clearly and allow the reader to weigh it alongside the rest of these narratives. A specific sculpture helps move this conversation forward rather than simply adding another mirror to the stack. In 2008, sculptor Luciano Garbati created a statue depicting Medusa standing upright, holding a sword in one hand and Perseus' severed head in the other. It represents a direct reversal to the classic imagery, where Perseus usually holds the head aloft as a trophy. Years later, a photo of it went viral, captioned, "Be thankful, we only want equality, not payback." Eventually, a bronze cast was installed in a small park in Lower Manhattan, positioned directly across from the courthouse hosting the Harvey Weinstein trial. It is reasonable to question whether this representation, the exact behavior discussed earlier, adding another layer chosen for its emotional satisfaction rather than its historical grounding. Perhaps it does, but I don't think every new telling of a myth should be considered automatically as a corruption. The narrative has undergone continuous reshaping. Hesiod adapted by Apollodorus, reinvented by Ovid, and transformed by 2 centuries of visual artists, and then reshaped again by the internet. If those iterations constitute living tradition, a contemporary sculpture holds equal right to contribute another version. And what makes this particular piece noteworthy is its nuance. It isn't a revenge story dressed up as art, tracing the narrative thread back to the version where she was the victim, cursed, and then used that curse to protect herself, where the only people who ever died by her gaze were the ones who came looking for her. And so, in my opinion, this statue depicts self protection rather than aggressive violence. It moves away from I will strike first towards I am no longer vulnerable to your harm. That isn't retaliation, it represents the end of a cycle. And for the first time in 3000 years, she isn't the figure being observed through a shield, she is the one holding the sword. A brief personal note is worth bringing here, as it directly connects to this pattern. This happens in photography constantly. Someone looks at an image I've created and project an entire narrative onto it that isn't remotely close to the original intention. They assume the mood, the backstory, the emotions, based on whichever version feels most satisfying to them in that moment. Most of the time, I leave those assumptions alone. Occasionally, their interpretation proves more compelling than the reality. But it's the exact same underlying mechanism. We don't see what's actually in the frame, we see through the filter of existing expectations, and then call that seeing a genuine understanding. I said something close to this in the video about the Vivian Myers story as well. A romanticized myth was constructed around her figure because that narrative felt far more comfortable than the raw, more ambitious reality beneath the surface. Different subject, same shield. So, where does that leave her? Born a monster, cursed for vanity, assaulted then punished for it, protected through transformation, reclaimed with a sword across from a courthouse. Five faces, one woman. None of these interpretations cancel each other's out, and no single authentic version sits waiting underneath like old paint ready to be stripped away. The objective isn't to uncover the one true version of her story. It is doubtful such a thing exists. For Medusa, or for most of what we think, what we understand clearly. I think the takeaway is more practical. Next time you hear a version of a familiar story that is different from the one you are familiar with, avoid instantly filing it as wrong just because it feels unfamiliar. Put the shield down for a second. Look at it directly. See what's actually there before falling back to the comfortable familiarity. We've been doing this for Medusa for thousands of years, selecting whichever face fits the moment and calling that her true face. Perhaps the time has come to pay attention to the complete truth rather than a small reflection. If this has made you reconsider a story you thought you already had settled, let me know which one in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. And until next time.